You're listening to
Catholic Sprouts,
the daily podcast for Catholic kids that strives to plant seeds of faith. Hey there, Sprouts. Today is Friday, February 18th, 2022. This week we have been talking about sin through the example of perhaps the most notorious sinner in human history, Judas. So we talked about how sin is either a wound or a break in our relationship with each other or with God. It's something we knowingly do when we choose to do what we want to do over what God wills for us to do. We talked about how Judas's little sins of stealing from the money pouch, that led to the big sin of him being greedy and choosing money as a motivation to betray Jesus Christ. We talked about how Jesus chose intimacy with Judas, even though he knew he would betray him, and how that gives us hope because we're sinners too. And if Judas was welcomed to the Last Supper as a sinner, then we're called to be at Holy Mass as sinners too. And yesterday we talked about what happened after Judas betrayed Jesus in the garden, how he gave in to despair, how he felt that his sin was unforgivable, that it was bigger than God's desire to forgive us, how that was a lie, and how God desires so deeply to forgive us, for us to start again, no matter what we might have done. And so, Sprouts, I just want to leave you with a story that ended so differently than Judas. And that is the story of St. Peter. Now, as you likely know from the story of the Passion, both Peter and Judas, they did horrible things while Jesus was going through his Passion. You can argue that Judas was worse, and maybe he was, but Peter certainly sinned big time while Jesus really needed him. Right? Jesus was inside the high priest's court being questioned and tortured. And Peter stood outside and lied and swore, claiming that he didn't even know Jesus. And who was he lying and swearing to? Just ordinary people, a maid, right? These people didn't matter. And yet Peter was so embarrassed to be one of Jesus's followers that he denied him. And he did this after Jesus had already predicted and told him that he would. And then he fled. We do not see Peter at the foot of the cross. He is simply gone. So imagine how he felt. He felt terrible. He had followed Jesus all of these years. He had watched him perform miracles. He had even sworn that he would go and face his death with Jesus in Jerusalem. And he was a complete failure. He chose something totally different. And yet, what happens after the resurrection? Peter, unlike Judas, he refused to despair. He probably was very sad and felt very guilty, but he trusted that God was bigger than these things. He continued to love Jesus. And when Jesus appeared by the seashore, after they had had some breakfast together, Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Do you love me?" Each time Peter says yes. And Jesus tells him to feed his lambs, feed his sheep, right? To get to work. And so that is the big difference. Peter refused to despair. He trusted in Jesus. He was able to go through the pain of facing Jesus, of having his love in Jesus being questioned. But he got through that. He recommitted. He remained part of this community of believers, and he became our leader, right? Peter was the first pope. We have an unbroken line of popes all the way to Pope Francis today. But it all started with Peter, a sinner who refused to despair, who trusted in God's willingness to forgive him and use him even though he was a sinner. And that is how our church began, through a sinner. So just remember that no matter what you've done, no matter what's kind of weighing you down or making you feel guilty, God desires to not only cleanse you of that guilt, but even to use what has happened in the past to make you a great saint. He used all that Peter was, what was, good and what was rough around the edges. He used it all to make him a great saint, a great pope who has established the church that we all dwell in to this day. And so, Sprouts, a little reminder about your challenge. Remember, you need to go to confession. Even if it's been only a month since you went to confession, it's time to go again. Let's not let those little sins lead to big ones. Let's not let the guilt hold us back. Let's go. And finally, of course, I'm not just talking to the children listening to this podcast. We all, as adults too, need to be going to regular confession. And so let's do that so that we can prepare to enter Lent in a holy way. And let's make sure we go to Lent confession during Lent as well. And so let's just carry this knowledge of sin, but also even more so of God's desire to forgive us always.
That's it for Catholic Sprouts today. We'll be back tomorrow, but until then, continue to grow in your faith and truly sprout into the beautiful creation that God created you to be.
Just one more note. We hope to journey with you through Lent with our Jesus tree. 2 versions. One goes through the Gospel of Matthew, one goes through the Gospel of John. If you are wanting to grab any supplies for Lent, we are quickly approaching our shipping deadline. So if you want to explore our materials for Lent, please check the notes in this podcast episode. And we hope that you and your family have a very holy and fruitful Lent.
This show is a production of the Spoke Street Media Podcast Network. For more great podcasts, visit spokestreet.com.